am Dr. Jaya Prakash Narayan. Today, we will discuss India's administrative structure in the context of federalism, competition and cooperation. How liberal it is. First, let's examine very briefly what is it we are looking for. What is liberalism? I can refer to you to something no better than Gladstone's statement. He says something very profound, very pithy. I very much like it. He said, the purpose of a government is to make it easy for people to do good and difficult to do evil. It's, in my judgment, a very profound statement because it encompasses all that we believe in terms of liberal philosophy. It circumscribes the government's role. It leaves us enormous liberty that we citizens are primary, government is secondary. It's our creature for a purpose, no more, no less. And the society is primary, the state is secondary. If we want to translate this Gladstone's quote into basic liberal principles, the norms, I would say there are 5 norms there on the screen. Liberty, self-governance, empowerment of citizens, rule of law, and self-correcting mechanisms. Only when all these 5 are in proper shape can we call that society and state a liberal structure. I will examine how liberal our governance structure is subject to these 5 norms, but we also have to examine the context. The context of Indian governance is A, the colonial past. After all, we did not start a governance in 1950 suddenly. There's a continuity. B, the constitution that we gave to ourselves. And C, the practice. Whatever the constitution or the law says, in reality, what are we doing? Let me therefore start off with the context, then we'll go into each of these 5 facets of liberalism. If you take the colonial past, obviously it was a mixed bag. Surprisingly, the British gave us a reasonably liberal governance structure despite being colonial masters. But obviously there are limitations. Ilbert Bill, which actually spawned the Congress Party, the Congress movement. Rowlatt Act, which led to a fierce desire on the part of Indians to seek independence. All these are very illiberal laws, and therefore we cannot really call them a liberal administration. Similarly, the power of the Governor General to dismiss the provincial government, which we subsequently incorporated in our constitution, or the Preventive Detention Acts, or the 3rd degree habitually applied by the police in dealing with potential culprits or citizens. All these make the British state illiberal, and yet, in several respects, there was a lot of liberalism. For instance, the society's law of the British government was extremely liberal. Now, the Constitution obviously gave us political liberalism in a broad measure with high degree of centralization, Article 356 and many other things. But the rule of law is still a continuity of the British Raj, the 3rd degree, excessive discretion in crime investigation, etc. Preventive detention laws even today. But the real damage was done by the economic management. The Constitution created directive principles which are broadly socialist, taking away the economic liberties of the people. And if you take the practice post-independence, a lot of it has been generally anti-liberal in the first 30-40 years. The socialistic pattern of society and the commanding heads of public sector mean that the government monopoly in the economic management of the country is very considerable, and people's economic liberties are restricted very severely. That apart, there is no police reform, therefore there is no real rule of law. Neither police nor judiciary are responsive enough in a structural rule of law. And Article 356 was abused more than 100 times, mostly for political gains of a party in power in Delhi. All these and many others make our Indian state and governance structure liberal but not entirely liberal. And the governance structure responded to this colonial past as well as the constitutional practice post-independence. Even today, if you want to form, let us say, a society, under some law or the other, there is enormous amount of restriction. The bureaucrats have immense power. Your economic liberty and your political liberty both are challenged on a daily basis. Cooperatives have been under the state control for a long time. And even today, while a constitution has been amended, the 97th Amendment, the reality is most cooperatives are under the government's control. We can go on and on. But the context has not been particularly liberal. But the good news is twofold. One, because of economic reform in 1991, the liberty of the individual in terms of economic decision making has been getting better and better, though there are still some significant areas which require to be addressed. Two, a highly centralized governance structure of the Constitution slowly gave way to more decentralized structure whereby the states have come into their own in the past 20 or 30 years. But there's a caveat. The local governments are still incredibly weak, despite the constitutional amendment, the 73rd, 74th amendments. The local governments are there only on paper with no real empowerment, and there is in general no accountability structure across the board. Now let us look at the 5 norms that we set for ourselves in terms of administrative structure. If you look at this slide, let me repeat quickly the 5 elements: liberty, self-governance, empowerment, rule of law, and finally self-correcting mechanisms. Each of these, we'll spend half a minute to understand where we are as a governance structure. Let's look at the way administration is operating in terms of liberty. Well, on paper, the fundamental rights are very strong, and we have constitutional guarantees and the judicial power to protect the citizens' rights. In reality, significant impediments exist. Let me talk about 4 specific problems. The first is rule of law is very weak. In the absence of rule of law, the ability to enforce rights on paper really don't mean much to most of the citizens most of the time. The second is economic freedoms, we all understand. Because of our obsession with socialism and economic centralization and government's license permit quota Raj, much of the economic freedom in the country has been curtailed. While some of it has been restored to the people after 1991, still it's only a partial effort and a lot more remains to be done. The third is property rights, which were recognized as a fundamental right initially, have been taken away. And today, while there is a provision for compensation and due process, in reality, the state can take away property at will. And fourth, education and healthcare, if they don't exist for most of the people, if you cannot access them, liberty is only notional. You can exercise liberty to fulfill your potential only when you have the capacity to enjoy that liberty and fulfill your potential as a human being. Now let us look at self-governance. We have the vote and the freedom to vote and real political competition in the country. But in reality, the political freedom, where it exists on paper, there are severe constraints. For instance, the party structure has become so autocratic. It's almost like personal fiefdoms running the political parties. They are meant to be vehicles for political participation of each of us, but in reality, they became private properties of few select individuals, and therefore much of the political freedoms are restricted. Then the electoral system imposed severe hurdles in a country of India's cultural and economic background. Because of illiteracy, inadequate understanding of the meaning of the vote, over a period of time, our electoral system meant that vote buying, offering freebies unrelated to normal government functioning, and fostering divisions for political purposes to create vote banks, they became the norms of our electoral behavior. And therefore, even if there is a free vote and the right to franchise, universal franchise, it doesn't really make it a liberal democracy. And this imposes a huge entry barrier. Even within the constitutional space, Article 356, for instance, meant that a government elected by the people at the state level can be dismissed at will by the union government, therefore curtailing much of the self-governance. In reality, governance is at the local and state levels, not at the national level. For all these reasons, while normatively again we do well, in reality, there are very serious deficiencies which are undermining our democracy and therefore the outcomes. Let us look at the third element, empowerment. Again, according to the Constitution, we the people have the power to protest, we have of course the freedoms to exercise, and so on and so forth. But in reality, there is no real empowerment impact in the governance. Poor service delivery means that most of the people, most of the time, are dependent on the bureaucratic machinery, and the roles of the master and the servant are reversed. The people who derive salaries from our tax money have become our masters, and we became the mendicants over a period of time. This was further exacerbated by this whole socialist mindset, whereby there is a shortage created, and for almost everything that we need, we have to go to the government and they have to deliver. And because there's already a shortage and discretion, they became the masters and we became the servants. Let us look at empowerment now. There are two elements of empowerment. One is, what is the government doing to make my life easy? The second is, do I always have to wait for the next election to make even the smallest change possible to improve my life? Now, judged by these two yardsticks, while normatively we have empowered citizens, in reality we have very weak and meek citizens. There are four elements that contribute to this weakness in empowerment. The first is very poor service delivery. The vast army of bureaucracy in the organized sector, in a country where 90% plus workers are in the unorganized wage earning sector, without any sense of security or influence, they become helpless in the face of the bureaucratic might. For almost everything that you need from the government, you are entitled to get. There is enormous humiliation, harassment, delay, inefficiency, and of course, ubiquitous corruption. This is further accentuated by the license permit quota Raj, because A, there is no economic freedom for a citizen to do whatever she wants to enhance her economic opportunities and her wealth, and B, because an artificial scarcity is created, you require the government bureaucrat to give you, without which you cannot lead your life with dignity. Now, because of this socialist mindset, the bureaucrat who ought to be the public servant in reality became the master, and the citizen who ought to be the master in reality became the mendicant, begging for these simple basic services or scarce commodities. All this is accentuated by very, very weak local governments. Highly centralized power means that most of the time when the government makes decisions, there is no link between the decision of the government and the outcome to the citizen. And the people do not understand the link between the vote that they have given and the consequences that follow. We have extremely weak, very enfeebled local governments. And finally, rule of law. Citizens are empowered only when rule of law is applied. That means the law is applicable to everybody equally. The rights are effectively enforced very quickly, fairly, and with complete non-discrimination, that everybody is equal before the law. Now, if these are not true, whatever we talk about liberties under the Constitution, a democracy as an operative system, they do not translate into the quality of life. In our country, rule of law is extremely weak. All these make empowerment very, very flawed in our society. Let us now look at our rule of law. You might have noticed that several times we mentioned rule of law in the context of liberalism and democracy, because mere rights are of no consequence, liberties are of no utility, unless there is a legal framework, an institutional framework to enforce those rights, to protect those rights. In India, our rule of law framework is woefully inadequate. 30 million cases, the world's largest number, are pending in courts. Whether it's a civil case where your property rights are disputed, or a criminal case where you might be accused of a crime or you have to investigate a crime, you will see enormous deficiencies in our country. The government of the day or the officials have complete discretion in managing crime investigation. Therefore, corruption, third degree, and false cases have become ubiquitous. We all know about the way the governments of the day manage the cases, how selectively prosecution is ordered or investigation is done. And the prosecution is weak too. It's also politically controlled, just like the police are, and is extremely weak and inefficient. The judiciary is tardy, procedures are extremely dilatory, very, very slow, and cases take 20-30 years. If you take the cases, criminal cases for instance, about 90% of the cases, they go unpunished. Generally, in well-established countries with a sound system of rule of law, 80 to 90% of the cases charged before courts end up in conviction. In India, only 10% end up in conviction unless there is a confession, which is mostly extracted from the poor and the weak without proper legal help, and often by coercion. In the absence of a rule of law framework and the ability to execute it efficiently, we cannot really claim to be a truly liberal society. And perhaps this is our weakest link in administration. Finally, let us look at the fifth element, self-correcting mechanisms. No matter how well a system is designed, how robust a society is, there are always going to be problems and flaws. But a wise system is one where we have a mechanism to quickly correct it. Internally, there are automatic correctives applicable. In India, this also is weak on three fronts. Take politics. We keep changing governments habitually. India has a very high rate of anti-establishment vote. 65% of the elected representatives are next time not returned to power, one of the highest rates of volatility in politics in the world. And yet, except that the faces change, nothing substantive changes. The more there is change, the more things remain the same. That is because we have an electoral system and a political management of the system with enormous entry barriers. Only those with enormous money, caste power, and significant organizational base at a personal level, only they can be contestants. I already mentioned before the enormous vote buying and the freebies, which are utterly irrational and dysfunctional, undermining the basic role of the government and expanding the unnecessary role. So far in this discussion, there are two key elements. One, there's a lot of theory we discussed, the normative approach and what is happening really. Two, we had a litany of woes about our country's administration, somewhat depressing. Let me move to something more uplifting. Let's look at some examples of where there's been significant success and understand why that success has been possible. And can we replicate that success by re-engineering the Indian state, making it truly more liberal, more responsive, more effective? I have 5 experiments before you, or 5 examples before you, which will perhaps give us some good understanding of when things work well. The first case on your screen is one of Alandur. Alandur is a small town in the outskirts of Chennai city, about 80,000 population. It is now subsequently merged with the Chennai Municipal Corporation. A very competent and inspired municipal chairman who had a good track record earlier and therefore enjoyed public trust. He built India's most efficient, perhaps the only sewerage system in a small town, about 600 kilometers at about 30-35 crore rupees. The people cooperated because of leadership, because power was decentralized, and he inspired the local people. And the upshot is, within 2 to 3 years, the property values in Alandur municipality shot up by 10 to 15 times. Because of only one reason. The local government provided the leadership, inspired the people, engendered trust, people responded, paid the future connection charges in advance, therefore made the work possible. It was executed very well. People understood the economic value of it. The market prices rose, and therefore it's no longer a theoretical issue. When the local government did the right thing, when the people responded, their property value shot up 10 times. Let's take a second example. ISRO is one of the most respected organizations in India. In a milieu of very bleak performance by government in general, all of us Indians across the length and breadth of this country are very proud of ISRO's performance. After all, they get very paltry resources by global standards. And the level of technical excellence in our country is still way below much of the rest of the developed world. And yet, the cost competitiveness and the quality of outcomes of ISRO are very impressive. Why? Because we created a model in case of ISRO where autonomy of the organization in day-to-day management, while the mandate is given clearly as to what are the outcomes that are sought. Clear devolution of resources with authority, and authority fusing with accountability. Once these elements are there, ISRO is able to perform remarkably well. Once these elements are there, ISRO is able to perform remarkably well. It is not that in organizations like ISRO, the best people went in, they had greater sense of values, and therefore they delivered. Elsewhere, bad people are entering. It's the same stock. The incentives are altered, therefore outcomes are different. Let's take the third case. One of my mentors in life was Verghese Kurian, the man who brought about the milk revolution of India through cooperatives of 75 million small farmers, illiterate, oftentimes caste-bound, tradition-bound, poor, weak, ordinary farmers, 75 million. Because Kurian had the genius to design a model where the people understood their own incentives, gave them ownerships through cooperatives which are well managed, gave them a transparent mechanism to see that their production actually leads to greater incomes. India became the largest milk producer in the world. We produce now more than 175 million tons of milk per annum. Tens of millions of lives have been altered. Here is an institutional model where even the poorest and the weakest can be made part of a governance and their lives can be transformed through application of liberal democratic model. Let's take a couple of other examples. Here, it is not universal success of an organization, but even the moribund, corrupt, dysfunctional administration on occasion dramatically performs very well. What are these occasions and why? You take, for instance, the election management. We have more than 1 million polling booths. We deploy more than 2.5 million workers, paramilitary forces, and policemen alone are about 2.3, 2.4 million. In addition, probably we deploy about another 2.5 to 3 million employees in manning the polling stations. So about 5 to 6 million people work in a time-bound manner. And on the whole, while what happens in the electoral backdrop, the vote buying, the freebies, the divisions, these are all things outside the control of the polling officials in the polling booth. But what happens in the polling booth on the election day is a marvel. Peaceful, orderly, timely conduct of elections, and peaceful transfer of power. The same machinery that has been part of the problem has become a very efficient, very self-governing, and very responsive and accountable system. Because again, we designed a mechanism during that very brief span, in that particular context, a mechanism where authority fuses with accountability effectively. The mandate is clear, accountability is clear, resources and authority is given to deliver the mandate, and the same people, they performed remarkably well. And finally, the fifth example, again, a moribund administration suddenly performing remarkably on select occasions. Take large crowds, Kumbh Mela, Earth Kumbh Mela. Nowhere on earth do 5 million people, 10 million people, they assemble at one spot. And that it happens in a poor country like India. And yet, it's very orderly, very precise, very efficient, is a marvel. Similarly, disaster management. Whenever a cyclone or some other calamity, the floods, they strike us, we have systems in place that actually deliver remarkably well. Similarly, VIP visit. Some people call it also another form of disaster. When a prime minister comes, a president comes, or a chief minister comes, everything is absolutely spick and span. And everything is very timely and orderly. So in select situations, again, we created conditions where there is authority and accountability fusing, a clear definition of the mandate, what exactly is sought from them, clear devolution of resources and accountability system, and therefore excellent delivery. In all these examples, there are a few common elements: robust institutions, strong incentives, fusion of authority with accountability, decentralization of power. These four together constitute the mantra to make our liberal democracy work for the people, to have efficient outcomes. Let me give you a striking visual example of this from the United States. I was traveling one day in California, Northern California, from east to west. To the north of that road is the city of Sunnyvale. To the south of it is Cupertino. The infrastructure is identical in both places. The mix of the population also is very similar. And yet the property values in Cupertino are about 60 to 70% higher than in Sunnyvale. There's only a road separating them. When I inquired, I found the reason. There's only one significant reason. The school district board in Cupertino functions extremely well. The outcomes are very good. And people get good value for the tax money they paid. Their kids get good education. Therefore, the demand for housing in Cupertino has far exceeded the supply. Therefore, the property value shot up. This is how a true governance is shaped. When there's a link between the vote and the public good, and people understand the linkage between taxes that they pay and the services they get, when authority fuses with accountability, then administration delivers, people's liberty is protected, you get good outcomes for the tax money that you pay. Why is our administration largely so illiberal and so ineffective? Why are we, as a governing system, underperforming, despite great ambition and extraordinary idealism and exceptional leadership in the early days of our republic? Our leaders were great and their ambition was real, and the people responded very well. But unfortunately, we have not realized that unless you create the initial conditions required to make a liberal democracy work for the people effectively, mere institution of liberty and universal franchise are not enough. We have failed in creating the initial conditions. Even at this late hour, we have to now reintroduce these elements. And for this reason, I placed before you a slide. Just look at it, think about it, and then the solutions automatically stem from that. The first element of insufficiency is asymmetry of power. I already mentioned to you the small organized sector controlling the destinies of the people, and 90% unorganized sector at the receiver's end. Now, this small organized sector, particularly in government, is all powerful. Relative to the people, they have immense power. 90% of the people who go before them, before the ordinary bureaucrats, are weak, very poor in resources, with no influence, often with no literacy. As a result, they become mendicants and service delivery is extremely poor. It has tremendous political, administrative and economic consequences. The second element is a sense of citizenship is lacking in our populace. We simply created a superstructure of democracy over a feudal colonial culture of tremendous antiquity. And mere vote did not give them a notion of citizenship. Even today, the Maibab culture, where the people automatically think that those in authority are the kings and we the people are subjects, is the norm. Except that there is a miracle called the vote, and therefore you decide the next king. Beyond that, democracy has not really interfered with our understanding of government. When the voice is not felt, when the people do not feel that they are taxpayers, that they are voters and therefore they govern the destiny of the country, that the government exists to serve them, they do not exist to serve the government or political parties. Unless people have this understanding of what is right, a democracy, however liberal it is on paper, will not function adequately and effectively. The third, we covered it extensively today, rule of law. Without institutions of rule of law, accountability, equal application of laws, and protection of rights, a democratic model is merely a paper model without any consequences. And finally, again, we covered quite considerably today, decentralization of power. In an over-centralized government, an election is a celebration. We don't know why it is so. We don't know what it is for. Depending on the fancy of the moment or the context, we respond collectively, viscerally, often based on primordial loyalties or emotions. Vote is no longer a true measure of our desire to improve things. All these four initial conditions and an electoral system that is ill-suited to India, which in ordinary conditions perhaps would have served us well, but because of these flaws has now become a millstone. We have to now alter that too in order to alter the political incentives for the players and for the political parties. And that is the road to not only governance transformation of India, but to make a liberal polity real, meaningful, transforming our lives and allowing us to do whatever we want to do with our lives in search of our dreams, and make the state an instrument in the service of our desires, our dreams, not people an instrument in the service of a grand state.